In the autumn of 1879, in the high desert country south of Taos where the cottonwoods went gold in a single week and the sky stayed wide and blue as painted tin, a woman named Nora Voss came into possession of a house she had never seen, on a road she had never walked, belonging to a woman who had known her only by letter. The widow's name had been Celeste Drummond. She had written to Nora twice a year for 7 years, letters arriving in Abilene wrapped in brown paper and addressed in a careful, small hand. Nora's mother had known Celeste in their girlhood in Missouri, before the war scattered them both. After Nora's mother passed of fever in the spring of 1878, the letters had kept coming. They were not sentimental letters. They were letters about the land, the way the arroyos filled in July, the cost of candle wax, the behavior of Celeste's fig tree, which produced fruit every 3rd year and refused to explain itself. They were letters from a woman who had lived alone for a long time and had learned to observe small things with great care. The last letter came in September of 1879. It was written by the hand of Celeste's neighbor, a man named Orrin Cale, and it stated plainly that Celeste Drummond had died of a heart ailment on the 1st of the month, and that she had left the house and its contents to Nora Voss of Abilene, Kansas, with the exception of one item, which would be explained upon arrival. Nora was 27 years old. She had $43, a carpet bag, a set of locksmith tools her father had left her, and nowhere pressing to be. She arrived in Taos on a Thursday, having come by train to Las Vegas and then by stage to the town itself, and ridden the last stretch on a hired mule that smelled of pine resin and disapproval. The road climbed out of the valley and the air thinned slightly, carrying a smell of sage and red earth and the distant cold of the mountains to the east. She had not been this far west before. Abilene was a flat place, a place of wide sky and wind-bent grass, and the landscape around Taos surprised her with its verticality, the way the ridges stacked against each other and the light fell at angles she did not expect. She had spent most of the journey reading Celeste's letters again, all 14 of them, which she had carried in the outer pocket of her carpet bag, and by the time she reached the rutted track that Orrin Cale's directions described, she felt she could have identified the house from its description alone. The house sat at the end of that track, half a mile from the nearest neighbor. It was small and adobe-walled and serious-looking, the walls the color of dried clay, the south face of the building catching the late morning light with a warmth that the north side would not share. A kitchen garden had gone to late-season seed along the east wall, the bean stakes still standing, the dry stalks twisted and pale, the soil cracked between them in a pattern like old leather. The fig tree stood in the side yard, and Nora noted at once that it was, as the letters had sometimes predicted, bare of fruit this particular year. Its branches were dark and angular against the sky, and it had the look of a thing that was paying attention to something you could not see. Orrin Cale met her at the gate. He was a lean man of perhaps 60, with a face like weathered sandstone, and the manner of someone who had spent years measuring his words against the silence they would disturb. He handed her the house key without ceremony. "She left directions," he said. "I read them." He nodded once. "Everything inside is yours. The kitchen things, the bedding, the deed, which is filed at the courthouse in her name and transferring to yours by the terms she set down." He paused and his voice stayed flat and informational. "Excepting the cellar." Nora looked at the house. "Why excepting the cellar?" "That," he said, "she did not explain to me." She found the cellar door at the back of the house, recessed into the north wall of the kitchen, and she understood at once why Celeste had not felt the need to explain. She had spent the first hour in the house going carefully through each room, the way her father had taught her to familiarize herself with an unfamiliar space before she touched anything. The bedroom was small and smelled of lavender. The parlor held a rocking chair, a braided rug of many colors, and a shelf of books mostly about natural history and the keeping of records. The kitchen was the largest room, built around a cast-iron stove of a good model, and on the shelf above it sat an orderly arrangement of dried herbs in paper packets, each labeled in Celeste's small hand. Nora read the labels: chamomile, pennyroyal, dried sage from the kitchen garden, she guessed. She left everything where it was and made a circuit of the room. It was when she completed that circuit that she found the cellar door, recessed into the north wall behind a shelf that had been partially moved, its contents stacked on the floor beside it. Someone had wanted the door visible. Celeste, in her final weeks, had made it easy to find. The door was old, older than the rest of the house, set into a stone frame that suggested the cellar had been dug before the adobe walls went up around it. The lock was iron, and it was not a common padlock. It was a 4-lever mortise lock of the type Nora's father had called a courthouse lock, heavy and precise, and built to outlast the building it was set in. There was no key visible. There was no key on the ring Orrin-Cale had handed her. The keyhole had been filled with wax, carefully pressed and smoothed, as though someone had taken deliberate care to seal it against dust or curiosity. Whatever Celeste Drummond had placed in that cellar, she had placed it with intention. Nora stood in the kitchen for a long time, studying the door. The light came through the south window in a long, flat band and caught the dust motes rising from the adobe floor. The house smelled of dried sage and old iron, and the specific stillness of a room that had not been opened in weeks. Nora's father had taught her that a lock was not a refusal. It was a question, posed in iron, and every question had an answer if you knew how to listen for it. His name had been Thomas Vass, and he had kept a locksmith shop in Abilene for 22 years, and Nora had worked beside him from the time she was old enough to hold a pick. She had learned the feel of a lever lifting, the small grain of resistance that meant a tumbler seated, the difference between a lock that was merely old and a lock that had been damaged. Thomas Vass had a saying he returned to often in different circumstances, with different examples. The work tells you what it needs. A lock that had sat in damp would have swollen components and would need more tension and less pick. A lock that had sat dry for years would be stiff in different ways and would reward patience over force. Every mechanism had a history and a personality, and both were legible to someone who paid attention. He had taught her to pay attention the way some fathers taught their daughters to mend or to bake, as an inheritance, a practical thing, a way of being useful to oneself and to others. Thomas Vass had died when Nora was 22, a lung ailment that came on in the winter and did not relent. She had run the shop for a year after his death, until the rent became impossible on what the town needed. Then she had closed the shop and taken work where she found it. She had done a season in a dry goods store in Wichita, and 3 months with a land assessor in Ellsworth, and a year and a half of letter carrying for a mercantile firm in Dodge City, whose owner trusted her roots and her punctuality. Through all of it, she had carried her father's tools in a roll of oilcloth, 3 picks of different profiles, a tension wrench of spring steel, a small mirror on a bent handle, a wire hook she had made herself from a section of clock spring. They were not elegant tools. They were working tools, worn smooth in the places she held them, and she trusted them the way she trusted her own hands. She set her carpet bag on the kitchen table. She unrolled the cloth and laid the tools out in their order. Then she took the candle from the shelf above the stove, lit it from the flint and steel she kept in her coat pocket, and carried it to the cellar door. If you have ever watched someone work a lock who truly knows what they are doing, You have seen a thing the world does not have a good name for. It is not performance, and it is not magic. It is a kind of listening. Nora pressed the flat face of the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyhole and applied the lightest possible pressure, less than the weight of a finger resting. She introduced the first pick and moved it slowly across the 4 levers, feeling each one in turn. The first 3 moved easily, old iron that had grown loose in its housing. The 4th was stiff and set deep. She noted this. She withdrew the pick and let the tension go. She had learned early that a stuck lever was information, not an obstacle. A lock that has not been opened in years tells you things about what happened to it. If the wax seal was Celeste's final act, the lock had been untouched for at minimum the week since Celeste's death, and possibly much longer. Nora reintroduced the tension wrench and picked the first 3 levers one by one, holding each, then worked the 4th with the hook pick, gentle, then firmer, reading the resistance. The lever had been stressed at some point, bent slightly by a key that no longer fit. She filed this away. She worked for the better part of an hour. The candle burned down a quarter of its length and the wax pooled on the stone of the kitchen floor. She tried 3 different pick profiles on the 4th lever, varying her approach each time, noting what each attempt told her. The lever was not simply stiff from disuse. There was a slight lateral wobble in it that suggested the pin retaining it had worn and shifted, probably from repeated use of an ill-fitting key years before the cellar was sealed. Someone had used this lock with a copy, not the original. A copy slightly wrong, and had forced it often enough to damage the lever's seat. She needed to approach the lever from a lower angle than the lock's geometry naturally allowed. She worked out the problem incrementally, the way her father had worked problems, each failed attempt treated as data rather than defeat. On the 4th profile and a lowered angle of attack, the lever seated. It moved with the resistance of iron that had not moved for a long time, then crossed a threshold and set cleanly, and the bolt drew back. The wax seal around the keyhole had cracked when the bolt moved. A thin line of air came through the seam at the door's edge, cold and still, the breath of a space that had been sealed for longer than she had first thought, not weeks. The air had the quality of a room closed for years, a particular stillness that was not merely the absence of breeze, but the absence of time itself, a seal against whatever had been left inside. She pulled the door open. The cellar was small and low-ceilinged, cut directly into the desert earth, the walls lined with flat stones fitted without mortar. Nora descended 4 stone steps and held the candle up. The room was perhaps 8 feet by 10. Shelves had been built along the east and west walls, thick pine planks on stone corbels, and on these shelves sat the things Celeste Drummond had seen fit to preserve. Mason jars of preserved plum, their lids still sealed, the fruit dark and whole inside them. A crock of what smelled even now like rendered lard, covered with a square of cloth tied with string. A small clay pot stopped with cork. A paper packet she did not disturb. The careful arrangement of someone who had used this room for years and had known exactly what was in it and where. None of these were the reason for the lock. On the floor at the far end of the cellar, beneath a piece of oilcloth that had been cut and stitched into a fitted cover with a cord drawn around its edge, sat a tin box approximately the size of a large ledger book, shallow and flat. Nora crossed to it and crouched. She untied the cord and lifted the oilcloth. The box was painted brown and it was locked, this one with a small brass lever lock of a kind Nora recognized, the type used on document boxes by lawyers and land offices. It was in much better condition than the mortise lock on the cellar door. It had been oiled and kept dry. Someone had cared for it. She looked at the box for a moment without touching it. If you have ever stood before a thing that someone else sealed and kept and chose, at the end of their life, to pass forward to you rather than destroy, you know that the moment before you open it carries a weight that the opening itself will not entirely discharge. Nora felt this weight. She had not known Celeste Drummond in person. She had known her only in letters, in sentences that observed the fig tree and the cost of candle wax. Yet Celeste had kept this box locked in a locked cellar for reasons she had not explained to her neighbor and had not put in writing, and she had chosen, in the accounting of her death, to pass the house and everything in it to Nora, except this one room. The exception was not a withholding, it was a direction. Nora carried the box up the stone steps into the kitchen. She set it on the table beside her tools. She examined the lever lock with the small mirror, noting its profile, and selected the pick she had made herself from a piece of watch spring. The brass lock opened in 8 minutes. Inside the box, nested in a folded piece of flannel, were 3 items. The first was a deed. The second was a letter. The third was a smaller envelope sealed with red wax, bearing no name on its face. Nora read the deed first. It was dated 1861, and it described a parcel of land amounting to 160 acres in the Rio Hondo Valley, 15 miles south of Taos, bounded on the north by the Acequia and on the south by a named ridge. The grantor was a man whose name Nora did not recognize, a name written in a formal hand that suggested a lawyer had drafted the document. The grantee was Celeste Drummond, born Celeste Orrin of St. Joseph, Missouri. The consideration stated was $1 and other valuable exchange. Nora put the deed down and read the letter. It was in Celeste's hand, the same small, careful script as the letters about the fig tree, but the language was different. It was the language of someone who had been carrying a thing for a long time and was finally setting it down. The land described in the deed, Celeste wrote, had belonged to her father before the war. He had purchased it in 1857 with money saved over a decade of farming. In 1862, while he was away from the territory on family business and Celeste was 17 years old and alone on the property, a man named Alfred Pruitt had arrived at the house with a paper he called a lien and a second man he called a surveyor. The surveyor had walked the boundary and made marks in a book. Pruitt had told Celeste her father owed a debt to a land company out of Santa Fe, a debt that predated the purchase and therefore encumbered the deed. The paper he showed her was in Spanish, which neither she nor her father read. He had taken possession of the deed she kept in the strongbox on the mantelpiece. He had given her in exchange a piece of paper he called a receipt. Celeste's father had returned 3 weeks later to find the property transferred in the Territorial Land Office records to the Rio Hondo Land and Grazing Company, a firm that had no office anyone could find and no officers anyone could name. The receipt Pruitt had left was a receipt for a transaction that the land office had no record of. The debt he had cited predating the purchase was documented in a ledger the company could produce on demand, and the ledger was dated 1856, 1 year before the original purchase, in a hand that no one in the territory recognized. Her father had gone to the land office. He had gone to the alcalde. He had found a lawyer in Taos who wrote 2 letters and then declined to write more. The land was gone. The family had relocated to the house where Celeste eventually died, a smaller property purchased with what little remained, and her father had died in 1871, still carrying what he knew without being able to prove it. What he knew was that the debt had been fabricated and the ledger entry had been forged, but the paper trail was the company's paper trail, and the family had none of their own except the original deed, which Pruitt had taken, and the receipt, which was worthless, except that 1 year before her father died, a retired land clerk named Saul Montoya had come to her father's house and told him something. Montoya had worked in the Santa Fe land office in the years after the war. He had processed the transfer of the Rio Hondo acreage himself in 1862, and he had always doubted the documentation. In 1870, cleaning out a storage room the office was vacating, he had found a second copy of the original deed, the one Pruitt had taken, which had been filed by the original seller as a duplicate with the territorial records in 1857. A duplicate the family did not know existed. Montoya had taken it. He had not known what to do with it. He brought it to Celeste's father. Her father had held it and wept and had not known what to do with it either. The companies and officers who had run the Rio Hondo land and grazing enterprise had dispersed. Pruitt himself had died in 1868. The land had changed hands twice since then. The family had no money for a legal challenge, and no certainty one would succeed. The father had given the duplicate deed back to Celeste when he realized he was dying, and told her to keep it safe until she knew what to do. She had kept it safe for 8 years. She had kept it in the locked box, in the locked cellar. She had not known what to do. She had decided at the end of her life that Nora might. Nora set the letter down on the table. She was quiet for a time. The late afternoon light had shifted, and the south window was filling with the orange rose color that came to the high desert in the last hour before dark, the color that made the adobe walls look warm and the dust look like gold. She sat with the letter and the deed in front of her, and she understood what they were together. The deed was the Declaration of Ownership, dated 1861, signed and witnessed and filed. The letter was the record of what had happened to it, and the third item, still in its sealed envelope on the table beside her left hand, was what Celeste had kept in the locked box in the locked cellar for 8 years, against the day when someone would know what to do with it. She picked up the smaller sealed envelope and turned it over. The red wax seal was intact. She broke it. Inside was the duplicate deed. It was dated 1857, filed by the original seller with the territorial office in Santa Fe, and it bore the receiving clerk's stamp, faded but legible, in red ink. It was in better condition than she would have expected. The oilcloth had done its work. The deed was the proof. Not the proof of what Pruitt had done, which had happened 17 years ago and to a dead man's account. The proof of what had been filed before him. If the original purchase was documented in the territorial records, the 1862 transfer rested on a fabricated prior claim against a deed that the territorial office itself had received and filed. That was the difference between a wrong that could be argued and a wrong that could be shown. There was a descendant. Celeste had mentioned her in the letter, her father's sister's granddaughter, a woman named Petra Orrin, who now lived in the Hondo Valley, 2 miles from the land in question, and who had grown up hearing the family speak of what had been taken. Celeste had been in contact with her. Petra Orrin knew that Celeste had something but did not know what. This was the work, then. Nora went out into the kitchen yard and stood in the last of the light. The fig tree stood in the side yard, its branches bare and angular against the sky. She had read in one of Celeste's letters that the fig tree produced fruit every 3rd year, and she had wondered at the time what patience it took to tend a thing that rewarded you on its own calendar, and not yours. She understood that better now. Celeste had tended this for 8 years, had kept the box oiled and the cellar locked, and had waited for the right hand to bring it forward. Some things required the patience of seasons. If you want to know what happened next, stay with this a moment. The following morning, Nora rode to the courthouse in Taos. She brought the duplicate deed in her satchel, wrapped in the flannel it had been kept in, alongside Celeste's letter and the tin box itself, as evidence of how the materials had been stored. The courthouse was a low building on the plaza, adobe like everything else. with a hall that smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the particular dry warmth of a room in which people spent a great deal of time waiting. The territorial land recorder was a methodical man named James Solis, who wore spectacles on a cord and who had the manner of someone who had processed 1,000 claims and intended to give this one the same care he gave the others. He read the duplicate deed in silence, then read it again with his spectacles pushed up on his nose, then asked if he could take it to the window. He stood at the window for several minutes, examining the clerk's stamp at the bottom of the document. He told her he would need to compare it against the land office records held in Santa Fe. He told her this would take time and he could not promise an outcome. He told her that the current holder of the Rio Hondo acreage was a ranch concern that had purchased it in good faith from the second subsequent owner in 1875, and that any question of title would implicate parties who had themselves done nothing wrong. Nora told him she understood all of this. She told him she was not asking for the land itself. She was asking for the record to be corrected, for the documentation of the original fraudulent transfer to be noted in the territorial file, and for that note to be made available to the Oren family if they chose to pursue a claim. She was asking, in other words, for the truth of what had happened to be placed alongside the record of what had been done, so that anyone who looked at that record in the future would see both. Not an erasure of the transfer, a notation beside it, citing the evidence she had brought. Solis looked at her over his spectacles for a moment. He was not, she thought, a man who was accustomed to someone declining to ask for more than they were asking for. "That is a narrow request," he said. "It is the only one I'm making," she said. She wrote to Petra Oren that same afternoon, a letter she carried to the postal office herself and watched slide through the slot in the wooden counter. She explained what she had found and what she had done, and she listed every document in the box. She explained that Celeste Drummond had kept these things safe for 8 years and had chosen to pass them forward in the belief that the time was right. She told Petra Oren that she could not undo what had been done in 1862, but she could place the truth beside it in the official record, and she had set that process in motion. The answer she received 3 weeks later was a single page in a hand, different from the formal letters she had half expected, a handwriting that was quick and direct, the handwriting of someone who had grown up working. Petra Oren wrote that her grandfather had died believing the land gone, and the wrong unanswerable, and her father after him. She wrote that she had lived her whole life 2 miles from that acreage, and had never allowed herself to want it back, because wanting it back had cost her family too much already. She wrote that the knowledge that the record would say what had happened, that anyone who looked would see the forgery noted and the original claim documented alongside it, was not the same as having the land returned. She knew that. She was not a child. Then she wrote that it was something. It was more than they had had yesterday. Nora kept that letter in her satchel for the rest of the time she stayed in Taos, which was 4 months, through the winter and into the early spring when the cottonwoods showed the first green along the river. She had not planned to stay so long. The house was hers, and it was warmer than she expected, and the work that Celeste had left her took time to complete properly. There was the land recorder's correspondence to answer. There was a second meeting with James Solis when he returned from Santa Fe with a sheaf of papers and a manner of controlled surprise, because the duplicate deed's provenance had checked, and the records confirmed what it claimed, and he had found in the 1862 file a discrepancy in the ledger of prior claims that he said he wished his predecessor had caught at the time. He could not speak to the legal question of title. He was not a judge, and he was not a lawyer. What he could do, and what he did, was append to the land transfer record a notation of corrected documentation, citing the duplicate deed and its provenance, and mark the prior claim entry as disputed with reference to the original sale record. It would not give Petra Orrin the land. It would give her the truth, written in the same records where the lie had lived for 17 years. Nora went to the Rio Hondo Valley in February, when the snow was thin on the ground and the ridge to the south showed its bare rock in long, dark lines. The road to the valley ran through a section of cottonwood along the acequia, the trees silver white and bare in the winter light. And when the track opened onto the flat ground, she could see the ridge that marked the south boundary of the old Orrin acreage 3 miles ahead. Someone had known every morning what was visible from their kitchen window. Someone had grown up looking at land their family was supposed to have. She found Petra Orrin's house at the end of a track marked by 2 juniper posts, and she was met at the door by a woman perhaps a decade older than herself, solid and deliberate in her movements, with the kind of face that had learned to hold what it felt without showing it all at once. She wore a work dress of indigo cotton, and her hands showed the particular callousing of someone who had spent years in soil, with rope and with tools. She did not ask who Nora was. She had clearly been expecting her, likely since the letter had arrived, and she stepped back from the doorway and said only that the coffee was made. They sat in the kitchen and Nora spread the materials on the table between them. The duplicate deed, the letter in Celeste's hand, the formal receipt from Solis's office acknowledging the filing of the duplicate deed and noting its provenance. Petra Orrin read each document slowly, her lips moving slightly over the legal language of the deed, and she asked questions that were precise and practical, the questions of someone who had thought about this problem for a long time without the tools to address it. She asked how the receiver's stamp at the bottom of the deed had been verified. She asked whether the prior claim ledger entry had been examined for handwriting differences from other entries of the same period. She asked what Solis had said about the current owner's awareness of the dispute notation. These were not the questions of someone encountering this history for the first time. These were the questions of someone who had already turned the problem many ways and was now, for the first time, holding a piece of it in her own hands rather than hearing it described. When she had read everything twice, she folded her hands on the table. The coffee had gone cold between them. She kept all of this, Petra said. For 8 years, Nora said. She was waiting until she knew what to do with it. Petra Orrin was quiet for a while. Outside, a wind came off the ridge and moved through the bare cottonwoods along the acequia with a sound like paper being turned. When she spoke again, her voice was level and not loud. "Will you tell me about her?" she said. "I never met her in person." So Nora told her about the letters, the fig tree that fruited every 3rd year, the cost of candle wax, the arroyos filling in July. She told her that Celeste Drummond had been a woman who observed small things with great attention and who had kept what mattered in a locked room against the day when keeping it would become doing something with it. She told her that the locked cellar had been, as she now understood it, not a secret, but a promise, a thing preserved until the right moment to bring it forward. Petra Orrin listened without interrupting. At the end, she nodded once, the same economy of motion Nora had noticed in Orrin Kale, the manner of people who live in a place long enough that they have learned to trust a small gesture, to carry what might elsewhere require many words. She did not thank Nora. She said, "I will speak to a lawyer in Taos about whether the notation changes what can be asked." Nora said that seemed right. When she rode back to Taos that afternoon, the sun was low and to the west, and the shadow of the ridge ran long and blue across the snow. She thought about her father's tools in her satchel, the picks worn smooth where she held them, the tension wrench that had belonged to him and before him to his teacher. A lock was not a refusal. It was a question. The question in that cellar had been simple enough, once she listened for it. What is worth keeping? And what do you do with it when it is time? She spent the last 2 weeks of her stay putting the house in order. She mended the kitchen garden fence. She had the roof repointed where the adobe had cracked at the northwest corner. She trimmed the fig tree in the side yard, taking off the dead wood and opening the crown to light, the way her mother's neighbor in Abilene had done with his pear trees, and the way her mother had watched and quietly memorized for later use. Celeste had kept the tree. Nora would give it better odds. She left in March when the road south was passable, and the sky had turned the clear pale blue of early spring. She left the house key with Orrin Cale, who took it with the same flat-voiced matter-of-factness with which he had handed it to her in the autumn. She had arranged to lease the house to a schoolteacher who was coming from Las Vegas, New Mexico, to take up a position in the valley. The rent would be paid to a bank account she would collect from a distance. The deed was in her name, and it would stay there. She carried with her 3 things that had not been hers when she arrived. The letter Petra Orrin had sent her, the one that said it is more than we had yesterday, a copy of the territorial recorder's notation, which Solis had pressed on her as a record of her role in the matter, and the brass lever lock from the document box, which she had taken from the tin box and put in her coat pocket on the morning she left. The lock itself now a small cool weight against her ribs as she rode. She kept the lock not for sentiment. She kept it because her father had taught her that every mechanism was a lesson, and this one had been well made and well tended, and had held what it was meant to hold for 8 years, without failing. That was a thing worth carrying. What Celeste Drummond had passed forward wasn't property in the end, though the house and the kitchen things and the faded receipt of an old transfer were all property of a kind. What she had passed forward was the obligation to do something with what she had kept, and the faith that the right person would know what that something was. Nora had not known before she descended those 4 stone steps. She had known with the certainty that comes from actually opening a thing, the moment the candlelight fell across the oilcloth cover on the floor. If you have found yourself thinking about what it means to keep a wrong alive against the day when it can be answered, leave a thought here. This road has more on it. The fig tree in the side yard of that house in the Rio Hondo country fruited the following autumn. The schoolteacher who had taken the lease wrote Nora a letter about it in practical detail, the way Celeste had once written those letters about small important things. Nora read it at a table in Colorado and wrote back asking how the figs tasted. She kept her father's tools oiled and in their cloth roll, each in its place. She kept the brass lock in her coat pocket until the lining wore through at the corner from the weight of it. Then she put it in the bottom of her carpet bag and continued carrying it there, because some things you keep not to use but to know the weight of. The record at the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe contained, from that year forward, a notation on the 1862 transfer of the Rio Hondo acreage, citing a duplicate deed of original sale and noting the prior claim entry as disputed and documented as such. Petra Orrin did speak to a lawyer. The lawyer wrote a letter to the current holder of the ranch. The letter did not produce a return of land. It produced, after 2 years of correspondence, a settlement paid to the Orrin family by the current owner's legal representatives, who had no personal stake in the original wrong, but whose own title was cleaner if the dispute was resolved by agreement, rather than left on the record to complicate future transactions. The settlement was not the land. It was not the full value of the land. It was what the truth in the record made possible, which was a different thing from either having the land or losing it entirely. Petra Orrin wrote Nora a letter about the settlement. It was a short letter, and it was not effusive. It said that the money would allow her to buy the parcel adjacent to her house that she had been trying to secure for 2 years, and that the parcel in question lay on the south boundary of the Rio Hondo acequia, within sight of the ridge. Within sight of the ridge. The words were not dressed up. Petra Oren was not a woman who dressed things up. They did not need to be. Nora folded the letter and put it with the other one in the pocket of her traveling coat, the one she wore in cold weather, so that both rested near the place where the brass lock had once rested. A country that loses its records loses its truth along with them. A truth that has been kept, even in a locked box in a locked cellar, can be brought into the light by the right hand at the right moment. That is what Celeste Drummond had believed. That is what, in the end, had proven to be so. The fig tree, the schoolteacher reported, had produced well. A bumper year. Celeste would have noted the date and the yield in one of her careful letters and filed the observation away against whatever years came after. Some things keep on that way.